Good evening, everyone. As Meg mentioned, I'm Katrina Grants, Deputy Regional Director for the Bureau of Reclamation's Upper Colorado Basin region. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today for the second of our two virtual public meetings on the draft environmental impact statement for post-2026 operational guidelines and strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. As probably all of you know, the Colorado River provides water for more than 40 million people and fuels important hydropower resources. It serves as a vital resource for 30 tribal nations and 2 Mexican states, and it sustains 5.5 million acres of farmland and agricultural communities throughout the West. Prolonged drought conditions over the past 25 years, along with forecasts for continued drying conditions, have made the development of future operating guidelines challenging. Today, we will be providing an overview of a range of possible actions that could be taken to address these challenges. I want to take a moment to thank all of the reclamation staff, as well as the basin states, tribes, our cooperating partner agencies, and the many stakeholders who have worked diligently to develop and complete this work. We're hitting an important milestone in the process of developing and analyzing a new range of possible operations for the Colorado River. The draft environmental impact statement was posted on Reclamation's website on January 9th and was published in the Federal Register the following week. We will be accepting public comments through March 2nd. We're looking forward to sharing information today and hearing some of your comments. Thank you again for your time this evening and especially for your interest in this important work. I would like to turn things over to Carly Jurla, who is our program manager for the Colorado River Post-2026 program. Carly?
Thank you very much, Katrina, for those opening remarks. Good evening or good late afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. As Katrina said, my name is Carly Jurla. I am the program manager for the Post-2026 effort. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Before I get started, I just wanted to recognize the broad team who is with me today, who served a critical role in producing this draft EIS. These are team members from the Upper Colorado Basin region, the Lower Colorado Basin region, our solicitor's office in DC, as well as our consultants, AECOM, and all of their sub-consultants. So thank you all very much. I also wanted to particularly recognize my co-speakers here on tonight's meeting. First up will be Alan Butler. He led the modeling effort and a lot of the technical work that you see in this draft EIS. And then he'll be followed by Dr. Rebecca Smith, who oversaw much of the DMDU or decision making under deep uncertainty applications that are a part of this draft EIS. So how about next slide, please, Meg? Okay, so what we have in store for you all tonight is a presentation before we get to the public comment part of the meeting. We're going to talk about the background of the process, an overview of the process itself, cover at a high level the purpose and need for action in addition to the proposed federal action, our stakeholder and partner engagement throughout the process thus far. I will then turn it over to Alan Butler, who will talk through the alternatives evaluated in the draft EIS. Rebecca will handle the EIS approach to analysis and an overview of the environmental consequences that are in the draft EIS. We will then respond to the questions that we've received through you all during registration. Also some questions that were posed during the last public meeting or that may have come in throughout that period. We'll talk about ways to comment on the draft and then open it up for public comment. Next slide, please. By way of background, there are several operating agreements that govern the operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead that are expiring at the end of this year. The primary domestic agreements are the 2007 interim guidelines adopted in 2007 and then amended in 2024, and then the 2019 drought contingency plans that were adopted in 2019. These agreements were adopted in sequence as we experienced critical drought in the basin since the adoption of the 2007 guidelines. And this effort, this NEPA effort, and this draft EIS are geared to identify options to replace those expiring agreements. Also adopted during this time was the Minute 323 to the 1944 Water Treaty with Mexico. This process is intended to develop the successor domestic agreements. There is a separate process through consultation with the Department of State to develop the successor international agreements to replace Minute 323. Next slide, please. As an overview to our NEPA process, we began the NEPA process officially in June of 2023, so roughly 2.5 years ago. We published a notice of intent to prepare an EIS in June of 2023, followed shortly thereafter with a publication of a scoping summary report with our published and anticipated purpose and need. That was in October of 2023. And then we spent the majority of that time from October of 2023 to the publication of this draft earlier in January, developing a broad range of alternatives for potential implementation for post-2026 operations. Once the public comment period closes on this draft EIS, we will take that public comment under consideration, use it to develop a preferred alternative that we anticipate publishing in the final EIS in the spring timeframe, then followed by a record of decision in the summer of 2026. Operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead began for 2027 for Lake Powell began October 1st, 2026. Lake Mead operations began January 1st, 2027. The August 15 determination in 2026 of those operations will commence, and we will have a record of decision in place to be able to guide those operations. Next slide, please. This is an overview of our purpose and need for action. As we talked about before, we have key operating agreements for Lake Powell and Lake Mead that expire in 2026. Federal law requires that the Secretary of the Interior coordinate these operations of the two facilities. We have seen low reservoir levels due to persistent drought throughout the Colorado River Basin, and there's the potential for increasing aridity. The current guidelines have not been sufficient to protect water supplies, hydropower, and infrastructure. We have had to adopt additional agreements in sequence to be able to deal with these increasing drought conditions and continuing low reservoir elevations. These new interim guidelines are needed to improve the predictability, flexibility, and system resilience. The draft EIS evaluates options to balance water deliveries and the protection of critical reservoir elevations. Next slide, please. The proposed federal action is to adopt new guidelines for a full range of reservoir operations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead to be implemented in 2027 in time for that August 15th determination. The focus is on Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam operations, again, for all reservoir conditions, but may include upstream actions and downstream actions that may be needed to protect critical reservoir elevations at these facilities. This action is designed to improve predictability for water users while protecting critical reservoir elevations. The proposed federal action will include tools to store and deliver conserved water in Lake Mead and or Lake Powell to increase the flexibility to meet water use needs. And regarding duration, the guidelines are intended to be interim to gain operational experience and are intended to be at least 20 years long, approximately 20 years long, which was roughly the duration of the 2007 interim guidelines. However, they may be shorter in duration or phased as part of a longer term framework. Next slide, please. There has been extensive stakeholder and partner engagement throughout this NEPA process. The earliest was through a pre-scoping effort that was conducted before the NEPA process was formally underway in 2023. Input was gathered and was used to form the notice of intent that initiated the post-2026 process. We published both a pre-scoping and a scoping summary report. We also developed a public web-based operations exploration tool to allow for the exploration of different operating scenarios that users could use to form any input submitted regarding alternatives. Throughout the course of the alternative development phase of the NEPA process, we worked very extensively with basin entities who submitted either detailed proposed alternatives or conceptual ideas. We worked closely with these entities to refine, analyze, and incorporate these concepts into a broad range of alternatives. We've continued to engage, and this document reflects the support of our cooperating agencies. These are the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Western Area Power Administration, the National Park Service, the International Boundary and Water Commission, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have also undergone regular consultation and coordination with the basin tribes throughout the basin through existing forums, information exchanges, and also government-to-government consultation. Thank you very much, and I will hand it over to Alan to talk about our range of alternatives.
Thank you, Carly. Good evening, everyone. So here we'll go through an overview of each of the alternatives and then step into some of the details with respect to the different components of each of these alternatives. So what you'll see here is a no action alternative, 4 action alternatives, and then a comparative baseline. What you do not see is a preferred alternative, as there was no preferred alternative identified in the draft EIS because of a lack of kind of a consensus-based approach to the post-2026 reservoir operations among basin entities. We do anticipate identifying a preferred alternative after the publication of the draft EIS that incorporates elements and variations of the alternatives included in the draft, and then that would be fully analyzed in the final EIS. So with that, we'll go through each of these alternatives, starting with the no action. The no action alternative is required by NEPA, and it signifies a return to our annual decision-making absent any objective criteria, which is a mode that we have purposely avoided since the late 1990s. Next is the basic coordination. This alternative is designed to provide environmental compliance for a set of operations that Reclamation could implement in water year 2027 if no new agreements among relevant entities in the basin are developed. The enhanced coordination alternative was designed to achieve protection of critical infrastructure and benefit key resources. This alternative was developed in close coordination with the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. It reflects concepts that were developed with basin tribes and also principles put forth by hydropower interests, including Western Area Power Administration and CREDA. The maximum operational flexibility alternative was informed by a proposal submitted by a consortium of conservation organizations. It includes operational concepts that promote maximum flexibility in water use. And finally is the supply-driven alternative, which includes Powell operations that are based solely on recent hydrologic conditions. The last one is the continued current strategies comparative baseline. It's not an alternative, but it is included because it's a more relevant comparison of performance, because it includes the operations that we're all familiar with from the last several decades, and it just includes a continuation of those policies. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through each alternative in a little bit more detail. Each table has the different components across the top. So we'll go through the shortage guidelines, the coordinated reservoir operations, a storage and delivery of conserved water, the surplus guidelines, and then any additional activities above Lake Powell. So we'll start here with the no action alternative. Again, this is a return back to an annual decision-making process, but we had to make some assumptions here with respect to what that could look like, and that's what we'll go through, starting with the shortages. The shortages are determined based on Lake Mead elevations, and they have a volume of 400, 500, or 600,000 acre feet at elevations 1075, 1050, and 1025 respectively. And those shortages are distributed in the lower basin based on the priority system. One thing to note here, it applies to all the different alternatives with respect to the shortage volumes, and then also some of the storage and delivery capacities, is that the volumes that we are stating are total volumes that are inclusive of assumed volumes with respect to Mexico's participation. Those are just modeling assumptions, and there's a long footnote here that states that we would be conducting all necessary negotiations through the International Boundary and Water Commission and State Department in compliance with the 1944 Water Treaty. But we did make assumptions and then report those as total lower basin volumes. Onto the coordinated reservoir operations, the no action includes an 8.23 million acre foot release from Powell unless more is required under equalization releases. And then less than 8.23 can occur if Lake Powell declines below elevation 3490, and then releases are not possible due to the infrastructure limitations at Glen Canyon Dam. And that piece is consistent among all of the different alternatives. With respect to the storage and delivery mechanisms, there in the no action world would be no new storage and delivery mechanism that would replace the intentionally created surplus or ICS mechanism, but there would be delivery of existing ICS in accordance with the existing agreements. For surpluses, the surpluses are limited to the 70R or spill avoidance strategy and flood control conditions. And then there were no specific additional activities above Lake Powell defined in the no action alternative. Next slide, please. Moving on to the basic coordination alternative. The shortages under the basic coordination alternative are again defined based on Lake Mead elevations, but they now include shortages up to a total of 1.48 million acre feet. And those shortages are distributed based on the priority system. The basic coordination alternative also includes identifying conditions when additional reductions may be needed to avoid reaching critically low elevations. So additional to the 1.48 million acre feet. For the Lake Powell releases, they are determined based on Lake Powell elevation. Unless equalization releases are required, the releases would range from 9.5 to 7 million acre feet unless more is required in those equalization conditions. And like the shortage conditions, there are conditions identified at Lake Powell when releases or other actions may be needed for infrastructure protection. Again, there is no new storage and delivery mechanism to replace ICS, but there is the delivery of existing ICS in accordance with the existing agreements. And like no action, the surpluses surplus determinations are solely the spill avoidance strategy and flood control conditions. For the activities above Lake Powell, the basic coordination alternative includes releases from the Colorado River Storage Project, or CRISP, upper initial units. Those releases are within their respective record of decisions and contingent on hydrologic conditions, and those releases would be made to protect infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. Once again, there would be conditions identified when additional upper basin actions might be necessary for infrastructure protection. Next slide, please. All right, the enhanced coordination alternative now has a different trigger for the shortage guidelines from the previous two alternatives. This alternative triggers shortages based on Lake Powell and Lake Mead combined storage. Those shortages would begin when that combined storage is 60% of capacity or less. Those shortages would start at 1.3 million acre feet and increase linearly up to a maximum shortage of 3 million acre feet when the combined storage is 30% full or lower. And this alternative, those shortages are distributed pro rata. This alternative includes a unique determination for Powell's releases that relies on Lake Powell and Lake Mead elevation or storage, the previous 10-year running average hydrology, as well as lower basin deliveries, and then sets the Powell release to help achieve a target storage distribution between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And then once you consider all of those factors, the releases are constrained to be within the range of 10.8 to 4.7 million acre feet. So different, again, from the no action or basic coordination, the enhanced coordination alternative now includes several new storage and delivery mechanisms. There is storage of up to 5 million acre feet in Lake Mead, with an additional 2 million acre foot protection pool in Lake Mead. And the volume of stored water in Lake Mead is included for purposes of determining the Powell releases and the shortages. This alternative also includes storage of up to 2 million acre feet in Lake Powell. That stored water is included for purposes of determining Lake Powell releases. Again, because the objective of the Powell releases in this alternative is to distribute storage, so it needs to be looking at the physical storage in both reservoirs. However, the water stored in Lake Powell is excluded for purposes of shortage determinations. Existing ICS is assumed to be converted to the new storage mechanism immediately, and this all of these storage mechanisms represent extensive flexibilities for all users that include intra and interstate transactions within each basin. This alternative also includes tribal water stored in these conservation pools, both conserved consumptive use and unused in the Lake Powell conservation pool and then in the Lake Mead protection pool. Just like the previous two alternatives, surpluses are limited to the 70R spill avoidance and flood control conditions. And now this alternative includes some upper basin conservation. The upper basin conservation is contributed to that Lake Powell mechanism, that storage mechanism. The alternative assumes that this conservation in the upper basin is dependent on hydrologic conditions and that it increases through time. So for the first 5 years, the maximum would be up to 200,000 acre feet per year, down to 0, depending on hydrologic conditions. That 200,000 acre feet is the max for the first 5 years. Then it increases to 275,000 acre feet for the second 5 years and up to 350,000 acre feet for the final, starting in year 11. through the end of the simulation. Next slide, please. The maximum operational flexibility alternative, again, reminder, this is the alternative that was based on the submission from a consortium of conservation organizations. Here, the shortages are determined based on a combined 7 reservoir storage, and also can be adjusted based on recent hydrologic conditions. The shortages start when the storage in those 7 reservoirs are 80% full, and it increases linearly up to a maximum of 4 million acre feet. If the hydrology over the past several years has been dry or extremely dry, then the shortages can increase faster. And this alternative distributes shortages based on priority, which is described in approach 1 of the supply-driven alternative. For Lake Powell releases, the Powell releases are based on the total upper basin system storage, and also can be adjusted based on recent hydrology. The releases can be adjusted downward if the hydrology is dry, and the releases vary from 11 million acre feet to a minimum of 5 million acre feet. This alternative also includes a switch to run-of-river operations. So essentially, releases from Lake Powell are equal to inflow minus losses once Lake Powell is at elevation 3510 or lower. The maximum operational flexibilities alternative includes a new storage and delivery mechanism where it can be stored in either Lake Powell or Lake Mead with a maximum storage of 8 million acre feet. This stored water is excluded for purposes of determining both Powell releases and shortages. So the stored water doesn't affect either Powell releases or shortages. The existing ICS is converted to this new mechanism over a 5-year period, and it represents extensive flexibilities for all users with transactions within and across basins, including interstate and interbasin. So this stored water can be stored in Lake Powell or Lake Mead and can be moved between the 2 reservoirs as necessary. This alternative only includes flood control for surplus determinations. And then, like the enhanced coordination alternative, it includes assumed upper basin conservation that goes into the conservation pool. For this alternative, it's assumed that the conservation averages 200,000 acre feet per year, but again, it's based on hydrologic conditions and more conservation occurs under wetter conditions and less conservation under drier conditions. And next slide, please. Okay, the last alternative is the supply-driven alternative. This alternative, like the first 2, the shortages are determined based on Lake Mead elevation. Those shortages start at an elevation of 1145 at Lake Mead and then reach a maximum of 2.1 million acre feet if Mead is at elevation 1,000 feet or below. This alternative has another unique way to set Powell's releases, and in this one, it is determined primarily based on the previous 3-year natural flows at Lee's Ferry, and the release is set to be 65% of whatever that previous 3-year average is. It says primarily because it can be constrained between 12 million and 4.7 million acre feet if that 3-year average is really high or really low. The supply-driven alternative also includes a new storage and delivery mechanism to in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. In Lake Mead, the storage mechanism has a maximum capacity of 8 million acre feet and is excluded for purposes of determining shortages. In Lake Powell, the storage mechanism has a maximum capacity of 3 million acre feet. And the existing ICS is converted to the new mechanism over a 10-year period. In this alternative, the storage mechanism represents expanded flexibilities and includes interstate exchanges within each basin. Unique to this alternative is an additional surplus tier or zone. In this one, there are surplus determinations based on 70R and flood control, but it also includes additional surplus if Lake Mead is at elevation 1165 or higher. For the additional activities above Lake Powell, this alternative includes those increased releases from the CRISP upper initial units up to a maximum of 500,000 acre feet per year and within the respective records of decisions. Again, it's contingent on hydrologic conditions, and the purpose is to protect infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. Like the previous two alternatives, there is assumed upper basin conservation going into the storage mechanism, and the conservation in this alternative is assumed to be up to 200,000 acre feet per year, again, based on hydrologic conditions. Unique to this alternative is gap water. So this is introduced to the system and tracked anytime Lake Powell's release cannot meet the required release based on that 65% of the 3-year average least very natural flow because of low elevations. Anytime that occurs, a constrained version of gap water is introduced to the system, tracked, and then set to be released in subsequent years when Lake Powell does no longer has those physical constraints. Next slide, please. And so finally, we have the continued current strategies comparative baseline. Again, not an alternative, but a more relevant comparison for performance for all of the other alternatives. Broadly speaking, it includes a continuation of the current operations, which are based on the interim guidelines, the drought contingency plan, and Minute 323. So shortages and DCP contributions are based on Lake Mead elevation. The shortages range from 400 to 600,000 acre feet, beginning at elevation 1075. And then it also includes the drought contingency plan and binational water scarcity contingency plan contributions, which range from 241,000 acre feet, starting at elevation 1090, up to 750,000 acre feet at elevation 1025 and lower. And it distributes those shortages and DCP contributions based on existing agreements. Powell's releases are determined based on Lake Powell and Lake Mead elevations. It includes 3 tiers where releases range from 7 million acre feet to 9.5 million acre feet, with the potential adjustment down to 6 million acre feet for infrastructure protection. And then also includes the equalization tier where higher releases are possible at higher Lake Powell elevations. The current storage mechanism is, again, the ICS, or intentionally created surplus mechanism, which has a maximum capacity of 4.2 million acre feet in Lake Mead. The delivery of existing ICS is assumed to continue through the analysis period in accordance with existing agreements and designed to reflect historical use of the ICS mechanism. And creation is also assumed to occur through the full period, again, to reflect that range of use of the ICS mechanism. The current operations include surpluses, of course, the 70R and the flood control, but also domestic surplus above elevation 1145 feet, and then also the increased deliveries to Mexico per minute 323. And finally, for the activities above Lake Powell, the continued current strategies baseline includes releases from those CRISP upper initial units, but as with all the others, within their respective rods and dependent on hydrologic conditions. And so with that, all of the additional details of these alternatives are included in the executive summary and chapter 2 of the draft EIS. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to Rebecca to go through the analysis and environmental consequences.
Thank you, Alan. Next slide. Okay, so this is a map showing the geographic extent or the geographic scope of the analysis, which means the geographic areas we're analyzing for environmental consequences. The top of the scope is the full pool at Lake Powell, or 3,700 feet of elevation, which is the mouth of Gypsum Canyon. You can see that labeled on the figure. And the scope follows the mainstream floodplain of the river down through Glen Canyon Dam, Hoover Dam, and through the Southerly International Border or Boundary, SIB, which is labeled at the bottom left of the map. The analysis also includes service areas in the lower division states that are outside the floodplain but may be affected due to water delivery reductions. Next slide. The technical approach we are taking to analyzing the alternatives is called Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty, or DMDU, and it is a framework taken from a well-established field of decision science. So even though it is new to our basin, new to our long-term planning, it comes with a pedigree of previous applications. We adopted this new approach to planning after over 10 years of research within our team, working with researchers at various universities, trying to see what approach we could take to long-term planning that did not have some of the downsides of our previous approaches. The primary reason we needed to adopt a new approach is the extreme uncertainty in future hydrology. So we really are not able to predict what's going to happen from year to year. And that uncertainty just increases as you go out multiple years and multiple decades. And despite many years of conducting studies with scientists and partnering with stakeholders to try to get more clarity about the long-term future of our hydrology, we just don't have enough to go on to be confident about exactly what projections to prepare for. So this DMDU framework allows us to avoid an overconfident prediction of probabilities or risk percentages. DMDU tests the alternatives in a wide range of conditions without locking in assumptions about the most likely future at the beginning of the process. So we throw this wide range of conditions into the model and test the alternatives without prejudicing what we assume will happen at the beginning. And this allows us to make some judgment calls after the analysis. The key to DMDU are two concepts, robustness and vulnerability, and those are framed in these two colorful boxes. Robustness is asking the question, do the alternatives meet key performance metrics in a wide range of future conditions? It is not a prediction of the percent of time some bad thing will happen, really just looking at how often alternatives can meet specific metrics. Vulnerability is asking the question, what hydrologic conditions are associated with failures to meet the key performance metrics? So under any given alternative, if it fails to meet some metric, what were the hydrologic conditions associated with that failure? For more information about DMDU, see Chapter 3, Section 2.6 or Appendix E. Next slide. The modeling approach to fulfill our DMDU framework requires a range of model inputs for important factors. The starting point is the initial reservoir conditions, or basically, where do Powell and Mead start in 2027 when a new alternative would become operational? For the modeling, we used 3 sets of starting elevations, high, mid, and low, and they're taken from October and November 2025 system projections. It's key to remember that we had to lock in model inputs well before the release of this draft, and that's why using a range was really smart. Unfortunately, the current reservoir elevations and most of the projections for 2027 are between the mid and low starting elevations. But the silver lining to our approach is that we do have that range covered. The future hydrology is represented by 400 sequences or traces that cover a wide range and variety of conditions, and this thoroughly tests the system under all of the alternatives. So those conditions include severe droughts, wet periods, and moderate hydrology in between the extremes. Future demands are represented differently in the upper and lower basins. In the upper basin, a single demand sequence developed by the upper basin states is used in the main analysis. That's the demand, but the modeled use varies based on hydrologic conditions and conservation mechanisms. In the lower basin, it's assumed that the full allocation or apportionment of 9 million acre feet, including the lower basin states and Mexico, is demanded every year, but the modeled use varies because each of the alternatives has shortage assumptions and conservation mechanisms. All the alternatives were simulated for 34 years in modeling that goes from 2027 to 2060. So we have a nice view of how things could play out long term. Next slide. Because hydrologic uncertainty is their biggest uncertainty, and because our hydrology is the biggest driver of how the system performs, we wanted to take a minute to unpack exactly what we put through the model. As I mentioned, we used 400 hydrology traces, and those were taken from 5 different ensembles or groupings of those traces. The 5 different ensembles incorporate multiple important data sources. So we're drawing from a lot of experience in our studies and our observed record, and a lot of perspectives on what the future could hold. This figure is from Appendix F, where we go into detail about the hydrology, but this one specifically is showing the statistics for droughts that are represented in these ensembles. The yellow boxes, and these are box plots or box and whisker plots, and they're useful for showing a range of data rather than just a single point. So the yellow box represents the full 400 traces all aggregated together. And then the other colors of boxes correspond to the different ensembles or data sources we used. If you really squint or zoom in on your computer, you can see what some of those data sources are. I won't go through them, but the key is to know that there are a wide range of conditions shown here, and that what we're specifically looking at is how those droughts, the different lengths of droughts, compare to what we've observed. So the leftmost panel is the driest 1 year volume, or what is the driest year that we find in any of these ensembles. And the very important threshold to note is this dashed line, which is kind of faint. You can't see exactly necessarily the volume or year, but it's 1977, and it's our lowest single year observed. And what you can see is that there are a lot of data points across many of those ensembles that fall below the lowest observed. The next panel over is the driest 2 year volume, or what is the worst 2 year drought. And again, there's a threshold for the driest 2 years observed, and there are lots of data points below that threshold. The next 3 panels are driest 5 year, driest 10 year, and driest 20 year droughts. And like with the first 2, you can see that observed threshold plotted in the dashed line. There's a lot of data below that line, meaning drier than anything we've observed. So we wanted to make sure that the public was aware that we did test the alternatives very thoroughly in conditions worse than we have observed. The great thing about how we designed this hydrology is that it allows us to connect different hydrologic conditions with different system outcomes, and to organize performance based on hydrologic conditions. And I'll show an example of that in the next slide, please. This is a figure from our executive summary, and it's bringing together a lot of different information to show some critical trade-offs. I'm going to take a minute to orient the figure. Across the top are 5 key system metrics. They are represented as vertical axes, and you can see the labels are percent of months Powell is greater than 3,500, percent of months Mead is greater than 975, percent of years where you've avoided dead pool related reductions, which means Mead stayed away from dead pool. which is elevation 895. The fourth axis is the average lower basin shortage, and the fifth axis is the average Glen Canyon Dam water year release. Each of the alternatives is represented by a colored line, and what those colored lines do is connect the dots or connect the axes across all of these 5 metrics. So you can see a summary of how each alternative performs in terms of these metrics and see how they compare to each other. Before I talk about specific results, I also want to point out that there are 3 panels of results here. The top one in yellow is called average. It's not called average because we think this is the average hydrology we'll see going forward, but rather because in the past 25 years, this range of hydrology is what the average has been. So between 12 and 14 million acre feet, natural flow at least vary. The next panel down is the dry category. So if the next 20 years are between 10 and 12 million acre feet, this is for the most part drier than what we have seen. And then the final category is critically dry, or if the 20-year average is below 10 million acre feet. The way to read these parallel axis plots is what they're called, is to compare the positioning of all of the colored lines across the metrics and to each other. So what you can see in the average panel is that the no action alternative, which is the red line, is the worst or lowest at meeting the Powell 3500, Mead 975, Mead dead pool metrics, and it also has the lowest lower basin shortage. The rest of the alternatives have a different pattern. They show that they are really high on those first 3 metrics, on those first 3 axes, and the shape dips down, showing that they have lower average lower basin shortage. All of these have kind of a range of different releases from Glen Canyon. But that crossing line between the 3rd and 4th axis is a visual representation of the major trade-off in the system, which is between reservoir storage and delivery reductions. So in the average hydrology, you can see that that trade-off is not so stark. As you go to the dry category, that the angle of those crossing lines becomes steeper, the trade-off becomes more acute. Still have the no action alternative in the red line, performing the worst across those reservoir metrics and having the least lower basin shortage. And then you get some spread between the rest of the alternatives, with the enhanced coordination and max operational flexibility having the best performance at reservoir storage, but the largest lower basin shortage. In the dry category, you can see that that trade-off gets even more acute, where the really large shortages in the max operational flexibility and the enhanced coordination can't prevent the reservoirs from going below critical elevations some of the time. So this is both a reflection of how the alternatives are constructed, but also just how dry some of the hydrology we tested is. And the key is being able to separate how they perform based on different assumptions about the future hydrology. Next slide. Thank you. So a really important question for any alternative is, how vulnerable is it in the next 5 years? Because we're starting at low elevations at Powell and Mead. We are exposed to going below those critical elevations. And these are 2 tables taken from the executive summary, which look at vulnerability within the next 5 years of Lake Powell and Lake Mead falling below critical elevations. Importantly, the results are based only on the low initial conditions. And unfortunately, that's kind of where the reservoirs are trending, but they make it particularly salient to unpack these tables. So the question is, in circumstances where these alternatives do fall below critical elevations, what hydrology caused it? What hydrology conditions were associated with the failures? In the top table, which is related to Lake Powell 3500, there are red arrows next to the alternatives that do show incidents of Lake Powell falling below this critical elevation. The 3 columns in the table are describing the hydrology and its frequency in historical record. The red boxes are around those conditions that we have observed in the past. So for example, the no action alternative would likely fall below 3,500 if the next 5 years averaged 12.9 million acre feet. And we aren't trying to predict how frequently they will go below 3,500 or how frequently we will go below that flow volume. But we have observed flow volumes, 5-year flow volumes below that 13 times since 2000 and 29 times over our full observed record. So the key pieces of information this is bringing together are what flow volumes are likely to cause this critical elevation to be breached and whether we've observed them in the past. And anything with a red arrow is vulnerable to things we've already observed. So it wouldn't be too shocking if they became vulnerable again, should they be adopted. You can dig deeper into these tables and the executive summary and review what is meant by vulnerability by going back to the draft EIS. Next slide, please. Finally, we recognize that the document itself is very long. There are many resources, 17 different resources analyzed, and there are lots of different figures and lots of analysis that it is useful to connect the dots to really understand how these alternatives are performing. So we commissioned this draft EIS figure viewer. All of the content in the viewer is lifted directly from the draft EIS. There is no new content, but what it does is make it very easy through drop-down menus to go directly to a figure you're interested in and enlarge the figure and see the descriptive text that's also included. So you don't have to scroll through 17 different technical appendices, and you can put up to 9 figures on the screen at the same time so that you can see analysis visually all on one screen and start connecting dots that way. It also provides convenient access to supporting materials for the different types of figures we used and the summaries of the alternatives. Thank you to the administrators of the Zoom. That link to the figure viewer is now in the chat. So with that, I am going to pass it back to Carly. Passing it back to
Carly, are you still with us? Okay, give us just a minute. We'll make sure whether Carly is still connected to the webinar.
See you.
Okay, we're seeing you, Carly, but I haven't heard you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? So lastly, before we start to get into the public comment portion, we wanted to talk through some of the questions that have been submitted either upon registration or have just come in through various modes of conversations in between our public webinars. So can you click on the first question, please, Meg? So the first question is, how is public input being handled and used? So all public input received during the comment period will be reviewed and organized. Reclamation would appreciate receiving comments that provide meaningful substantive ideas or feedback related to the alternatives and or the environmental analysis. And based on the comments received, we will consider revisions to be included in the final EIS. The next question asks, how does the draft EIS address the need to reduce water use? The range of shortage volumes and conservation mechanisms incorporated into the action alternatives demonstrate that reducing the use of Colorado River water is a fundamental component to respond to the challenging hydrologic conditions and achieving a sustainable system. There's various substantive sections that describe how such shortage volumes and conservation mechanisms could affect particular water uses under the alternatives. Reclamation encourages affected water users to review and comment on these sections. The third question asks if the draft EIS addresses assumptions about how water users could adapt to water delivery reductions, such as through compensated adjustments to agricultural activities, municipal conservation programs, or desalination plants. The purpose of the draft EIS is to analyze how different Colorado River water shortages and conservation volumes impact resources within the geographic scope. The EIS does not incorporate specificity about how affected entities could adjust their own water use to adapt, and this preserves the flexibility for implementation. We're supportive of a wide range of approaches that water users may take to manage their individual situations. The next question recognizes that most alternatives result in Lake Powell and Lake Mead falling below critical thresholds under some future conditions, and asks how will Reclamation manage the reservoirs under these conditions. The alternatives use various mechanisms to protect elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and then the trade-offs with respect to these mechanisms are described. Reclamation welcomes any comment on such mechanisms. For all operations and alternatives, the Secretary reserves the authority and discretion to operate federal facilities to protect infrastructure and respond to emergency conditions. The next question asks if the final EIS will include analysis of a preferred alternative, specifically a consensus-based states proposal. Reclamation anticipates selecting and analyzing the preferred alternative in the final EIS, which may contain elements from multiple alternatives analyzed in the draft. The next question asks if any of the draft EIS alternatives include constraints on upper basin uses or require reductions in upper basin water use. While the focus of the proposed federal action is operations at Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam, management strategies may include activities upstream and downstream of these facilities to protect critical reservoir elevations. The upstream activities that are considered in this draft EIS include operation of the Colorado River Storage Project upper initial units that are within their respective record of decisions and various levels of upper basin conservation. The next question asks how tribes are being engaged in this process. I want to first say that we are very grateful for the ongoing tribal leadership and collaboration with us on Colorado River matters and the post-2026 process. We've been engaging with the tribes in several ways through government-to-government consultations, regularly standing information exchange meetings, and other numerous technical meetings and presentations since the beginning of the EIS process. We've considered and incorporated tribal input in the range of alternatives. In particular, the enhanced coordination alternative reflects work of extensive tribal engagement to develop conservation mechanisms in both Powell and Mead that explicitly incorporate tribal water and interests. In addition, some of the shortage distribution methods explore how shortage would look if shortage was excluded in terms of impacting lower basin tribes. And the last question asks about how does the geographic scope influence operational components of the alternatives and translate to impacts, especially with respect to the upper basin. So just to reiterate, the proposed federal action is focused on Lake Powell and Lake Mead operations. The geographic scope of analysis is from full pool at Lake Powell down to the southerly international boundary with Mexico. But there are management strategies that include activities upstream and downstream of Lake Powell analyzed in this draft EIS. There are 2 upstream activities of Lake Powell that are particularly included. These are 1, upper basin conservation, and 2, operation at the upper initial CRISP units or Colorado River Storage Project units, if warranted to protect critical reservoir elevations. The operation of those upper initial units that are specifically contemplated in the draft EIS are intended to remain within the scope of the existing record of decisions for those facilities, and accordingly, the draft EIS does not expand the geographic scope of analysis upstream of Powell. With respect to upper basin conservation, the nexus to the proposed federal action is the storage and delivery of that conserved water in Lake Powell. The effects of this storage and delivery from Lake Powell are within the scope of the EIS and analyzed, while the specific activities that may be undertaken in the upper basin to generate that conserved water are not within the scope of this EIS. And any such activities are unknown at this time and will potentially require other environmental compliance activities that may be assessed outside of this EIS. So we appreciate those questions. And next we will turn to the public comment portion of this meeting. Just to reiterate, this public comment period closes on March 2nd. There are multiple ways to comment. You can do so during the remaining hour of this meeting. You can send an email to our public email. There's a telephone line. You can send it by regular mail, the address below. You can also find additional resources on our project website. And then here's the link to the EIS figure viewer as well. So thank you very much. And with that, I will turn it back over to Meg to kick off the comment period portion of the meeting.
Great. Thank you, Carly, and thanks to all of our presenters for all of that information. I do note that we have a few people listening by phone, so if you all would like any of this information we're showing on screen, I'm going to read it out and give you just a moment to grab a pen or a pencil. For those here with us in Zoom, you can click on the chat to see these details if you'd like to copy and paste them for your future reference, and I'll also include the project website link in addition to the figure viewer that was already shared here in the chat. And that project website is a great resource that includes all of these same options for submitting your comments by March 2nd. So for those of you listening on the phone, if you'd like to submit a comment via email, the email address is crbpost2026, POST2026 @usbr.gov. And the telephone number where you can leave a comment as a voicemail is 602-789-3889. Now we're going to transition into the period of our meeting where you all have a chance to provide verbal comments for the record. These will be treated just like comments submitted via any of those other methods. And I'll just share a few reminders with you all before we get into that and explain how you can share your comments. Comments provided during this meeting will go on the record, as I mentioned, just like written comments, and should focus on the draft environmental impact statement. We ask that comments be directed to the Bureau of Reclamation rather than other commenters. And we will limit comments today to 3 minutes so we have time to hear from as many commenters as possible. And of course, if you have comments longer than 3 minutes, you can of course submit those in writing. This virtual event is designed to be viewed in homes across the country in real time, so I'm sure this goes without saying, but profanity is not acceptable. So for those who would like to share public comment with us today, the way you can do that is here in Zoom, click the raise hand button. If you're listening on the phone, you can press *9 on your keypad, and that will raise your hand for us here in Zoom. I will see all those hands raised, and we'll call on you in the order you raised your hands. I will call out your name to let you know that it's your turn. And apologies in advance if I mispronounce your name. Please do correct me. And I'll ask you to click unmute in order to speak. If you're listening on the phone, you may need to click *9 or press *9 on your keypad. And to start your comment, we ask that you state and spell your name for the record to begin. As I mentioned, you'll have 3 minutes to comment, so you'll be able to, for those of you in Zoom, see this 3-minute timer here on screen to keep track of how much time you have left. And of course, any longer comments can be submitted in writing. I'll also note that our interpreters will be interpreting comments into Spanish for those listening in the Spanish audio channel. And if anyone prefers to offer their verbal comments in Spanish, our interpreters can assist in interpreting your Spanish comments into English for the benefit of the Bureau of Reclamation staff listening. So if you'd like to share a comment in Spanish, just do the same, raise your hand, and when we call on you, you can let us know that you'll be speaking in Spanish, and we'll just ask you to give us a moment to make sure our interpreters are set up to support you. So with that, we will open it up for public comments. If you have a comment to share, look for that raise hand button in your Zoom controls, or if you're on the phone, press *9, and we will call on you in the order we see your hands. So I'll give folks just a moment to find that raise hand button. All right, I think we're ready for our first commenter. I see Rob Billerbeck. Rob Billerbeck, if you intended to raise your hand for a comment, you should see an option to click unmute so you can speak to us. Okay, I'm not hearing anyone. And that hand went up a little while ago, so it's possible it was an accident. I'm going to lower the hand. But Rob, if you are there and wanting to submit a comment, please just raise your hand once more and we will see if we can get you unmuted. All right, any other commenters at this time? Great, I see Wendell Kuntz.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation tonight. My name is Wendell Kuntz. I'm a county commissioner in Delta County, Colorado, and I also chair our local basin roundtable here in Colorado for the Gunnison Basin. My real concern, my comment here is I don't see very accurate economic or social analysis of utilizing the CRISP units for balancing Mead and Powell in any of the alternatives presented tonight. And the second concern I have is I never understood where the gap water comes from and how it's accounted for. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other hands up at the moment, but I know people may be giving it some thought, having taken in a lot of good information from our presenters. So we are standing by if you have a comment to share. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up at the moment, so we will continue to be available for the remainder of the scheduled meeting period for anyone who would like to comment. I'll go off camera in a moment if we're not seeing any hands up, but if you think of a comment you'd like to share, please just raise your hand and we'll come back on to receive it. And the meeting will officially close at 7:30 Mountain Time. But it looks like we may be a little bit quieter today on the comments. Yes, Ed Miller.
Thank you. My name's Ed Millard, ED Millard. I had some questions about defending critical elevation and run of the river. The one alternative you discussed, you're certainly talking about defending 4990. The one run of the river option that you discussed was maximum flexibility, and you talked about 5010. I was wondering if that is the lowest elevation that you are going to allow is 5010, or is that when you were going to start doing run of the river? It's my understanding that the turbines may run rough below 5020, and I was wondering if you were confident that the turbines would be safe and operate correctly below 5020. I'm also curious to know, when are you going to decide to start defending the critical elevation, especially if it's in run of the river? Are you going to wait until you get to those elevations and then start doing a run of the river on the daily basis? Or are you going to start doing that when there's still some margin of error? So I'm sort of curious at what exactly point and what method will be determined when you start defending it, whatever critical elevation you're doing. I'm curious to know if you're doing run of the river or whatever you're doing to defend a critical elevation. Will that be a daily run of the river, monthly, or annualized flow matching? It would seem to me that annualized flow matching would be easier, better, more flexible, but that would require you to preserve enough water from spring runoff in the reservoir so that you could operate a turbine for an entire year. I would sort of be interested to know if you're going to document this in the EIS and how much detail you're going to go on to how this would work. I'm in particular of interest, how much water do you think would be necessary to have in the reservoir when spring runoff ends to assure that you could safely get to the next spring runoff without losing the one turbine that's maintaining the flow in the river and have to go to the bypass tubes? And again, the LaFawn report that's out in 2024 seems to indicate that you will not be able to safely run the reservoir or the river off of the bypass tubes. So it seems to me that you will have to defend the critical elevation on the turbines. Since you have to defend the critical elevation on the turbines, the question is, can a case be made that you'll leave water in Flaming Gorge to defend them? Finally, in 1968, there was a national obligation in the CRPBA, MOU, and I'll put it there, for the Bureau to augment the Colorado River. You shirked this about 1975. Don't you think it's time to revisit it, especially as far as putting the Welton Mohawk desalination plant back in service? Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
All right, we'll do just a quick reminder for those who may be ready to sign off of those options for commenting. Again, the comment period closes March 2nd, so you do still have some time. And you have the option to submit comments via email, via that telephone hotline, or by mail to Bureau of Reclamation, attention BC 00-1000, PO Box 61470, Boulder City, Nevada 89006. And those details are in the chat for your reference as well. So for anyone who may be off to the rest of their day, thanks for joining us. And the team will be staying on till the scheduled end time to hear any additional comments. Thanks, everyone. Looks like we have one other person wishing to comment. I'll just invite you to unmute, and that is John Weisheit, or correct me if I've mispronounced your name.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Carly, for the presentation. I have more than 3 minutes of comments. Can I write them and email to you? Can I do that in the next 24 hours?
Yes, anytime in the next, between now and March 2nd is the deadline.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
All right. As we approach our scheduled end time of 7:30 Mountain Time, I just want to say thank you once more to our presenters and to everyone who participated in the meeting this evening. Thank you for the comments. And I will turn it to Carly to share any closing remarks on behalf of the agency.
Thank you, Meg. I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. We really appreciate your attention to these very critically important matters and your comments, and we look forward to hearing more from you as we make our way through this public comment period. So thanks again, and have a good rest of the night.
Thank you. With that, we are adjourned.